Welcome to part 2 of Chapter 12 in the Executive Branch, looking at the Presidency. I'm Mr. Rodman, here to take you through those chapter notes. Now, if you remember in part 1, we talked about the roles and powers of the president. Where in Article 2 does the president derive his powers? What roles does he play? And what role does executive privilege and the executive powers have on the executive branch and its impact on the judiciary and the legislative branches? Today we're going to look at who helps the president, who is actually the staff of the president. We'll take a look at the executive office, we'll look at the White House staff and the cabinet, and then wrap up this chapter and everything with chapter 12. So let's look first at the cabinet. We're probably most familiar with them. Those are the secretaries of various departments in terms of the roles that they play. We'll take a closer look at how they interact with the president in just a moment, but let's look at the differences between these four groups of people that work for the president. The cabinet essentially work as head of the departments, and they work around Washington. So, for instance, the Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, works at the Pentagon. He doesn't work in the White House. He will come to the White House often, but he works at the Pentagon, and those are the roles that the cabinet secretaries would play. The White House staff are the ones that proximity-wise work the closest with the president. They see him on a daily basis. They're just down the hall. You know, the president may pop in. They're working in the West Wing, if you can think about it that way. The executive office of the president are those that work in various agencies within the old executive office building, which is just adjacent to the White House. If you ever see pictures of the White House and you look to the left or to the right, if you're looking south and you look to the left, you see the Treasury building, but if you look to the right, you see this massive structure office building. It's dark gray, and it's called the old executive office building. It used to be the Department of War, Department of Treasury, I believe, and Department of another department. There were three departments there, and the idea is that it is now housing the executive office staff. So the Office of Management and Budget, the people that come up with the president's budget and make sure that the budget is in line, they work there, as well as a number of key staff. The Council of Economic Advisors, for instance, that reports to the president on the economy, works there, and they're the ones that, again, they're a little further away from the president. They may not see him on a daily basis, but they may see various people who work for him, as well as he may pop by from time to time, or they may be called to the West Wing on occasion for meetings with the president, vice president, chief of staff, and people like that. And then the last group is really the one in the lower left here, is the independent agencies. These are the agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or other agencies that are really independent aspects. And we'll look more in the bureaucracy chapter at how do we delineate an independent agency, a regulatory agency from other executive agencies and independent agencies, and we'll look at those in a little more detail in the bureaucracy. But we're really focused on these other three groups in particular and the role that they play. So as I mentioned, the executive office of the president, they're really working the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, the National Security Council, the Council of Economic Advisors. These are the ones that work for the president in various capacities, honed in on a particular topic or subject area that they're focused on. They are working in the old executive office building, and they're doing a lot of things independently of the president and the West Wing staff, but reporting to the president ultimately. He sets the agenda. So this could include, and the CIA has its own headquarters, obviously, but the CIA, Office of Personnel Management, again, they have their own place, but in OPM, they're the ones that determine whether the federal government is open in bad weather. That's probably how we know them most. They also do the background checks on people who are hired by the government. And then the Office of the Trade Representative, the people who negotiate trade agreements and treaties on behalf of the president when the president is preparing to take trips and that sort of thing and work out trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, or NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is where the president can take the set the agenda, and the trade representative would carry that out. Now, White House staff are the people who work closest, as I said, physically close to the president. These are people like the chief of staff and counselors to the president, people who have really White House staff roles. They're not confirmed by the Senate, but the president really does have these staff really do have the president's ear, and the importance here is you don't have to be Senate confirmed in order to get time with the president, and we see this with the Trump administration. We have a number of people vying for the president's attention. Over the past year, we saw this with Steve Bannon and General Kelly, now the chief of staff, and the president's daughter Ivanka and son-in-law Jared Kushner. So there's a number of people working in various capacities as White House staff, and every president, most presidents have had this type of a role where they have people working closest to them to give them guidance that's unvarnished and based on information that they're gathering that he's asked them to or sent them on. And that's the important piece here, because you have to understand that being near to the Oval Office also gives you some leverage in terms of being able to convince the president in some cases, not all, but in some cases, what you should do next. Now, obviously, the toughest job in show business is the press secretary's job, because Sarah Huckabee Sanders comes before the media every day, and I would say, from the time she gets up in the morning until she goes to bed at night, I'm sure she is just pummeled 24/7 with requests, questions, and follow-ups from members of the press, and she just doesn't have time to get to all of them. And even having a deputy press secretary and a staff within the White House press office, you still can't get to everybody. But she does have a press briefing, normally in the afternoons, somewhere in the afternoon, depending on the timing. And the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, reporting to the President, and really the President's gatekeeper in terms of setting the agenda, who the President sees and who can get into the President, get the President's ear. He's really tried to do a better job. Reince Priebus, that was kind of one of the faults that he had, the former Chief of Staff. So here is a bird's eye view of what the West Wing looks like. I thought this was kind of important for you to see. You can see the Oval Office down here in the middle, and then you have the cabinet room where we see the secretaries of the various departments meet with the president. The president's secretary would be here, and then you've got the Roosevelt room, which you've seen in many pictures, where President Trump meets with various groups and various staff members. The president's study is just off the Oval Office. There's a dining room. Here is where he normally has a lunch with the vice president, and here are other advisors. The chief of staff office is down here, along with the vice presidents and the national security advisor. There is another floor then that would take you upstairs, and if you actually Google that, I'm sure you can find it. But the idea is that that proximity, really, there's not a lot of people there in terms of the in terms of how many offices are located there. It is small space, but the idea is that the people most important to the president in terms of relying on feedback from them on an almost hourly basis are really closest to him. Here are pictures of the Oval Office. You can see the old Resolute desk. This is the one used made out of an old Great Britain World War II warship, and you can see President Reagan standing behind the Resolute desk. Many presidents have used this particular desk, and obviously the rugs change with the presidents as they take them up and then move them to their presidential libraries so they can recreate the Oval Office in their presidential library, and then the new president gets to pick out their new drapes and carpets and that sort of thing, and President Trump is no exception to that. President Obama did as well, and they all do. Let's talk about the cabinet. We've got 14 cabinet secretaries, an attorney general, and they are overseeing that bureaucracy we talk about. Along with the agencies and everybody, you've got a 2 million plus staff in the bureaucracy, thus earning the nickname that we've heard President Trump call it the swamp or the state. The state being the governmental state, but the idea here is Presidential advisors were mentioned in the Constitution in terms of people that would report to the president on important things. And they do have to be confirmed by the Senate, but if you look in Article 2, it talks about people who would head up departments. Didn't necessarily call them, cabinet secretaries or that sort of thing. But the idea is that they can be fired at will. They serve at the pleasure of the president. So at any time they can be asked to leave at a moment's notice. We saw that with the chief of staff when Reince Priebus was out. He was in the motorcade and found out that he was no longer needed, and his car veered off the motorcade and went back to Washington to clean out his desk, essentially. The idea is they oversee the president's agenda within the department. Now, a lot of those people working within the cabinet or within the departments that the cabinet secretary would oversee are actually civil service employees. Those are people that passed a civil service exam. They've worked for the department for a number of years, many of them for many, many years. And the idea is that they cannot be hired and fired just politically. Those are reserved jobs, the plum book jobs that we talked about 4,000 of those. But the idea here is they set the agenda in terms of what those workers should be focused on. Where should they be using their time in that 8-hour day that they have, 40 hours a week. And so the president sets the agenda, sends it out to the secretaries of those various departments, and obviously in hiring them, inform them of what their job would be, and as the agenda changes, the chief of staff and the vice president and the president meet with them to basically make sure that the agenda is being carried out. Now we see this carried out in the Department of Justice with the Attorney General Jeff Sessions. We see this at the Department of State with former ExxonMobil CEO, Chief Executive Rex Tillerson, who is now Secretary of State, and with General James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, who works at the Pentagon. All of them are carrying out the president's agenda, and they serve at the pleasure of the president, as I mentioned. You can pause it here if you'd like to take a closer look at the different departments and when they were created. This is from another textbook, but I found it interesting. I thought you might find it valuable in terms of what they actually do. We'll take a closer look at this in the bureaucracy when we drill down into the departments, but a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory. I mean, agriculture department is going to work with farmers, so with agriculture. Health and Human Services is working for the health and safety of Americans, and the education department focused on today's schools and getting ahead and being competitive in the global workplace. This is the cabinet room, as I mentioned. The president would sit in the middle, as you see here with the chair. The cabinet secretaries, there are plates on the back of the chairs. The chairs do change as the cabinet secretaries change because they're allowed to take their chair with them if they pay for the chair. They can keep it. It's got a nameplate with their name and the month and year that they were installed. So many of them January 2017. In which they were installed, and as they leave, a new chair takes its place, and if they want to buy the chair, then that chair is replaced, and if they don't want to buy the chair, it sticks around for the next person, and that's kind of how that works. But again, they do have to pay the government for that. They pay the General Services Administration, the GSA, for that, and they can keep the chair. Just side note. In terms of setting the agenda, can the president keep the cabinet and the departments on the agenda? Well, that's another story. A lot of times you have civil service employees that know how the system works and they know how to work the system. Is probably the best way to put that. So you have people that know how to slow things down and also how to speed things up, depending on their own political ideology. And so we see that many cases that the people working for these agencies really are more loyal to the agency than to a member of a political party or members of a political party. And that can be a very good thing, depending on your administration. It could be a bad thing, but for the American public as a whole, somebody focused on the agency. Now, if the administration coming in is trying to revise or streamline that agency and bring about change, if they're opposed to change, obviously that wouldn't help. but that is a factor that is in play. And that's where Congress's job in oversight and conducting hearings and calling those agencies on the carpet and approving their funding and their budgeting is also a role that they play there. Now, know that the First Lady doesn't have an official position, but she does tend to take on a particular issue, and the First Lady here has been taking on issues with bullying, with childhood bullying, and Michelle Obama took on childhood obesity with the Let's Get Moving campaign, and Hillary Clinton focused on healthcare. So each First Lady has a particular pet project that they'll take on, but they are not paid for by the government. They are not given an official position. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives the First Lady a salary per se. I believe they do have a budget out of the White House budget, but for staff and that sort of thing. But the First Lady themselves do not take a salary from the government. And then that leads us to other types of roles, the independent agencies, different commissions, ambassadorships and judgeships and that sort of thing. These are sort of independent, and the president does appoint them depending on the role. The ambassadors, of course, would be Senate approved, and the independent agency heads in many cases are approved, as well as any judgeships to circuit courts or obviously to the Supreme Court. But many of them, other agencies, are pretty independent. We have executive agencies, and again, we'll go into more detail on the executive and independent agencies, the regulatory agencies, and then kind of the corporate entities in terms of their differences. But remember, they serve at the pleasure of the president, except for those in the judicial branch. Once they're confirmed, they serve for life, unless they're impeached and then in the Senate trial they're removed from office. And we have had federal judges that has been the case. We'll go into more detail on that in Chapter 14 on the judicial branch, but those are the ones that can be removed. Otherwise, all of these individuals that are appointed by the president can be removed at whim, at the pleasure of the president. An acting appointment is one in which you're on an acting basis. There is a time limit to it, though many cases the time limit isn't honored. A good example of this was in the last year of the Obama administration. The education secretary stepped down, and a new one was named as acting secretary because there really wasn't a lot of time for confirmation and to get them in there, and the concern was implementing Common Core and really getting the acting education secretary out there to meet with superintendents and schools and that sort of thing. So they made the president made an acting appointment, and that in that case is serving at the pleasure of the president, but the president's term runs out, and obviously all the department secretaries will leave at that point for a new president coming in. Now, a recess appointment is where the president's bypassing Senate approval in order to try and get an upper hand in the appointment. Maybe it's a controversial one, someone that the Senate likely would not confirm. So the recess appointment would need to be approved by the Senate at the end of the next Congress, or they would have to be reappointed, and then they'd have to go through that process again anyway. But the recess appointment advantage is you can bypass the Senate in not having to get Senate approval for it. And we have seen that happen during the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, in terms of those types of things happening. When you've got divided government, you see this happen the most. If you have unified government where you have the same party in power in the White House and in the Senate, you don't really need a recess appointment because you're probably going to get approval anyway. And that's the point of the whole thing, is that the power is in the hands of the president when it comes to a recess appointment, but you have more power over it in a unified government, obviously, than in a divided one. One of the biggest roles, we talked about the bully pulpit, but one of the biggest roles the president has is really taking his information to the people, using the bully pulpit to get the message out, to set the agenda, to really to really set the tone and get the media talking about what you want them to be talking about. So there's a lot of what we call photo ops, appearances that the president will manage and the president's staff will create in order to set the agenda and get the media talking about what they want them to be talking about. And that's really the point of the role of going public. And also to mobilize them. Why does President Trump use Twitter? Because he's got a loyal following of people on Twitter that want to hear his message and that take his message to heart because they believe that they're not getting the same type of message from the media. Maybe they're not as trustful of the media as they feel, and the president can go directly. The beauty of social media today is that an elected official can go directly to the voters. You can follow them and directly find out from that person what's going on, how they feel about the issues. That hasn't been the case in the past. You know, FDR had to work through the media. Teddy Roosevelt had to work through the media. Eisenhower had to work through the media, and even LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, during the Great Society and during Vietnam, had to work through the media. He said, if I can't convince Walter Cronkite that we can win this war, I've lost the American public. And Walter Cronkite being the anchor on CBS Evening News. If you've lost the media at that point, you really have a hard time winning over the public because of the adversarial press that we talked about during the chapter on the media. So you got to be careful here, though, because it could also backfire. You could also make yourself look really bad or put egg on your face, and that isn't a message that you want to be sending out there either. So in terms of setting the agenda, there's a number of things the president can do and talk about. But you remember, you got to talk about the things that people care about. You're talking about things that don't matter, you're quickly going to be just creating noise that nobody's paying attention to. You want to talk about taxes? Impact my taxes. Why did the Republican Congress and President Trump focus on taxes as an issue? Because people care about it. They want to see how it impacts what money they're bringing home. And if Uncle Sam's got his hand in their wallet, that's a concern they have. Now, that can be debated on both sides, right? In terms of taxes, a number of issues in terms of what taxes pay for, and shouldn't we be paying for things that the government provides. Again, this is a policy debate in which we can attack ideas, and we will, and we have, and we will. But the president and the Congress, because they have Twitter accounts too. You can follow Ben Cardin or Chris Van Hollen, our senators from Maryland. You can follow them on Twitter and see what they're talking about. But I guarantee you that they're going to be talking about the same types of issues that President Trump is on Twitter, as well as Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and the other social media that are out there. But the president really sets that agenda. The State of the Union address, as we know from Article 2, is called for in not an address, but a report on the State of the Union. As we talked about in Part 1, President FDR, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, submitted it in writing. But the president has a chance to set the agenda here and really focus the Congress on here's what I think is important. They can also make policy proposals. LBJ did this. If Congress gives me a legislation on how we can reform education, I will sign that bill. That was a message, and take out education and put something else in there. And we've heard many a president talk about that. President George W. Bush talking about reforming the tax code and privatizing Social Security. Congress, give me a bill on privatizing Social Security, and I will sign that bill. And the idea there is that it may not always be successful, but the idea is that the president can set that agenda. We have seen a number of polls, and presidents many times like to look at polls in terms of how are we doing? How is the message being received? What's our approval rating? It's all over the map. Notice George W. Bush, his highlight, 89%. Right after 9/11, when we rallied around the flag, the importance of coming together as a nation. We saw this with the Bush 41, George Herbert Walker Bush, around the Persian Gulf War, when everyone was rallying around the flag, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And we continue to see this again and again after President Kennedy was assassinated. We saw Johnson's approval rating spike at the beginning when we're rallying around the flag, the importance of we're Americans first and political parties later. Now, obviously, you can see here that declines over time, but the importance of putting the putting the citizenship and the whole idea of we are Americans before we are political parties is really the message being sent home here. And then once that starts to fade after a particular big conflict and a nationwide concern, then you see political parties start to fray that public approval will continue to drop. Now, it's all over the place, and obviously it can be up one day and down the next. It can change depending on the economy. We've heard it's the economy stupid, right? And it can change depending on what the president says and does, and also how people are impacted by that. If you don't have a job and a presidential election's coming up, you're probably going to vote with "What have you done for me lately?" Probably going to vote for somebody else. If you are finding that the president isn't doing what you want to do, then it's a concern that you might take to the ballot box and award someone else with that particular job. So it does change as time goes on. We do tend to see that 7-year itch. People are ready for somebody new, and that's typically holds true for presidents as well as most things. The legislative liaisons work for the executive office of the president. This is a critical role because they are basically the outreach to the Congress about the president's agenda. They're going to go to Congress. They're going to talk with members of Congress about what the president wants to carry out, how they can make it happen, how they can work together, and how they can support those members of Congress in iron triangles to help get things done. And we've seen this again and again and again in terms of the role that a legislative liaison plays in the president's legislative agenda and getting it supported on Capitol Hill. Now, is it fair to judge the president based on limitations? The president can only do so much. When George Herbert Walker Bush essentially won the Persian Gulf War, but lost the battle at home for jobs. Basically, it was the economy stupid and people threw him out. And that is basically generalizing a very tenuous 4 years. But can people do that? Of course they do. We know they do it all the time. Is it fair to do it? Well, it just depends. But the idea is that it's something that you have to understand, that it's the enormity of the presidency and part of it. You also are limited in terms of what you can do if Congress is not of your party. If you are a divided government, you have limitations there as well. The media, again, you can only win them over so much, and as you can see with social media, you can take it directly to the people, directly to the voters, and you have a number of people within the civil service, within the bureaucracy, that can also limit your power. So it again is something that does lend itself to the president really wanting to take that message and get the message out there, be consistent, and try and win the voters over. All right, so that's it for Chapter 12. I'm going to highlight and go through these questions and just give you the questions and answers, but I hope you found this helpful. Don't forget to watch the top 12 highlights from this chapter that you should be able to find on YouTube as well. And I hope you live the 5, and we will see you in Chapter 13.